I'm delighted to introduce our second in the EV Summit online series this year with a hugely exciting event, End-to-End EV Experience, Understanding the Fleet Electrification Journey. My name is Mary Brooks. I'll be hosting today and in partnership with a global leader in fleet management software, Geotab. Over half of new road-going vehicles are purchased by fleets. And if the sector were fully zero emission at the tailpipe, it would represent half of the number of vehicles expected to achieve this by 2030. It would also remove as much as 30 million tonnes of carbon dioxide tailpipe emissions, around a quarter of all transport tailpipe emissions. So the sector can also give rise to an important second-hand market for electric vehicles that are more affordable at the point of sale for private ownership as well. So a sector that can really drive the transition to e-mobility. A recent surveyation study commissioned by London First, which involved more than 500 UK companies, found that almost a third of fleets are already using electric vehicles. And a further 46% have active plans to make the transition. Another 16% are having discussions about it now. So the appetite is clearly there and rapidly growing. The question is, what does the end-to-end journey for electrifying a fleet entail? And I speak from a little bit of experience around this myself. I previously led a business transformation program that included fleet electrification, and I know it can feel overwhelmingly complex. I worked at a local authority trading company that delivered services from street cleaning to waste collection, highways engineering, and had a very large and varied fleet to go with those services. So the added complication then, of course, is that fleet managers are now having to think about EV charging infrastructure as well as their normal kind of vehicle replacement role. So there can be a bit of a chicken and egg challenge around overcoming that, specifying vehicles and looking for chargers for your business at the same time. So as well as that commercial and technical transaction costs of the transition, there's a significant effort required in terms of staff engagement and development of roles. So that's why today's event is so necessary. And our fantastic lineup of speakers today will walk us through this end-to-end with practical steps required in the fleet electrification journey, covering use cases, challenges, and how to prepare for 2030. Since being established in the year 2000, Geotab has grown from a small family business to a global leader in solutions for fleet management and vehicle tracking. As a proven leader in the Internet of Things and connected transportation, Geotab securely connects commercial vehicles to the internet. And it provides advanced web-based analytics to help businesses better manage their fleets and make data-driven decisions. Geotab's key industry differentiator is its open platform solution, which promotes a network of cooperation, enabling businesses to integrate data processed from Geotab connected vehicles into any system, regardless of business size or operational needs. And Geotab is now the largest commercial telematics organization in the world and the first to surpass 2 million connected vehicles built on a single open platform. So quite a lot of knowledge and expertise there that we're really, really pleased to have for this event. Now, before we kick off and introduce the first speaker, we have a poll to gauge the appetite in our audience today for fleet electrification. That should be appearing on your screen right now. So if you can go ahead and take part in that poll, we are asking, does your organization have a fleet electrification target? No, we have not started yet. No, but we're working on it. Yes, a moderate target, or yes, a strong target. And a strong target would be something that perhaps covers the majority, more than half of your fleet, whereas a moderate one would be less than that. So if you can get clicking on that, and we will have the results up shortly. They should be popping up any second. So what have we got? A big spread then, actually pretty evenly across that, which is great. It just means we have so many people here in the audience today, and you're all at different stages of that journey. And hopefully, as we kind of go through our end-to-end process, that's going to speak to all of the questions and needs that you have. Now, speaking of questions and needs, we will, throughout the event, be asking you to post your questions for our speakers. So if you've already got those in your mind, please do get them into the Q&A as soon as you like. So on to our speakers for the day, and we have an excellent panel lineup. We have David Savage, Associate Vice President, UK and Ireland at Geotab. Poppy Welch, Head of Go Ultra Low. James Keamy, Head of Insights at Podpoint, and Ollie Cron, Head of CSR at DPD UK. So first of all, we're going to introduce our speaker, Poppy Welch, who's going to get us going. Now, Poppy is the head of Go Ultra Low. It's a joint government and industry campaign with the aim to provide information on switching to an electric vehicle. If you have questions for Poppy, please submit them into the Q&A tab. And Poppy, great to see you, and thank you for joining us today. Now, Poppy, we've got a brought forward government date for ending the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans to 2030. It's a clear signal to all of us to make the shift, but of course it may also seem a little overwhelming, whether that's the reality or it's perceived. And at a time when businesses already have a lot to cope with. So I wonder if you can help our audience get under the skin of this goal and where we begin. So for example, could you tell us a bit more about the start of the journey to fleet electrification? Why make that switch?
Sure. So firstly, thanks for having me on, and hello everybody. So Go Ultra Low, I might just give you 2 seconds of background on what we're here to do. So we're a campaign that was set up a number of years ago to sort of encourage the uptake of electric vehicles, both amongst consumers and businesses. And as you say, although we are a long way from where we were about 6 or 7 years ago when our campaign was set up, as you say, it's still a sort of overwhelming minefield in many ways, whether you're an individual consumer or a small business or a large business looking to do this. So what we aim to do is, I guess our strategy in many ways is twofold. We want to get people and businesses interested for a start in making this switch. So, there can be essentially, if we're talking about businesses, I suppose there are 2 main reasons why you might want to switch from petrol and diesel to electric. Those probably sit in the CSR category and in the cost category. And I think probably many businesses now have sort of appreciate that CSR element is really important, particularly for those businesses perhaps with younger customers. It's even more important because I think younger generations are less willing to sort of use businesses that aren't seen to be at least trying to be environmentally friendly in some way. So that, when it comes to their vehicles, that's important. I'm sure some of the other panelists can talk more about that as well. And then obviously costs. Now, lots of people are concerned about the cost of electric vehicles. But over the years, I think, we and other organisations have managed to sort of convince people that actually, if you look at whole life costs, running costs, there are clear savings to be made, and particularly for businesses who are looking at costs very, very closely. There are lots of things, and I can talk about some of the areas in which there are sort of cost savings to be made. So I suppose one of the first things that we might talk about is the plug-in car grant or the plug-in van grant. So that's whereby the government offers up to £3,000 off the cost of an eligible car, or up to £8,000 off the cost of an eligible van. So there's a really good start there. So, if you are looking at upfront costs, there will be discounts on those if you're looking at zero emission vehicles. And then all sorts of other things. So for example, if you're looking at company cars, last year the government introduced a 0% benefit in kind tax rate on zero emission vehicles, and that only goes up to 1% in the next financial year and 2% the year after. So a really good advantage over petrol and diesel vehicles, where the rate, and someone might correct me here, but there's around 16% or something like that. So a really big discount. And then when you're getting a bit more into the nitty gritty, you can get grants from the government to put chargers in at your workplace, for example. It's up to £350 per socket, just up to 40, so quite a generous scheme there. And then when you're looking at sort of costs related to the individual vehicles. There is, you know, if your business works in and around London, you won't be paying the congestion or ULEZ charges. And there are other things as well, but as you can see, there's a kind of case built up there on the cost front. Of course, it's not just costs. There are all sorts of other things to consider, and you know, campaigns like ours sort of hope to help businesses understand some of those. You know, so whether it's No,
I was just going to say, what are the kind of hurdles that you're helping businesses overcome?
So, you know, we try to help out with information on charging infrastructure, the range of vehicles available. People often cite lack of choice as a potential barrier as well, but actually now there are kind of well over 100 different electric vehicles available, and that's across fully electric and plug-in hybrids. So, you know, that concern is certainly lessening as we go on, and there are so many more vehicles coming to launch over the next, you know, few years. Every automotive manufacturer has got really robust electrification plans coming up, so that choice will only increase. So that's good for businesses. And I was talking about charging as well. So obviously people are concerned about infrastructure, but again, that is improving all the time. So whether you're looking at workplace charging and the grants I talked about, or access to public charging, I mean, I think we're already up to around 38,000 publicly accessible charge points, which, you know, could be used by businesses where possible. So it's those kind of things that we try to help give hopefully useful information to businesses looking into this. I guess we see ourselves as quite early on in the sort of purchase and investigation journey, as it were, because essentially our initial job is just to get those businesses thinking about this in the first place.
And that's an interesting point, isn't it? I certainly remember from the experience that we had when I was dealing with this on the ground, was that with quite a varied fleet, you know, and I think, you know, we were quite well up on looking at the whole life cycle costs and factoring all that things in. So it got to the point where for the cars and small vans, actually we were quite comfortable as to what would work and what wouldn't work. But later on down the line, as we were progressing on that journey, actually that was the point at which we I think maybe had the capability from the first steps to take on something a little bit more complicated, like what happens if you need to fit that van out for a particular trade purpose, or you know, what if the person using that van has to go home in the evening, or they're on call outs or something like that. So it is definitely a journey that businesses are on, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And like I say, you know, there's a stage where you just start thinking about it. And actually one thing to add is, you know, we talk to businesses who actually see this as somewhat of a marketing tool as well, particularly, you know, as we move towards 2030 and 2050 net zero targets. You know, all businesses sort of have to be looking at this kind of thing. And if you're seen to be the first, there is certainly, I think, a customer set who are really interested in this. So actually, it can be quite beneficial from a sort of customer acquisition point of view as well.
That's really, really good to hear, and good to hear you're seeing that with actually engaging directly with businesses. So shall we move on? We've got some questions that have come in for you, Poppy. So the first question I'd like to put to you is from Alejandro Alvarado. How should electric vehicle fleets think about support services like roadside assistance? So is there anything different about that? You know, who's providing those services? Is that something you're able to touch on?
I'll be quite open. It's not a huge area of expertise, but I do know that both insurance companies and roadside assistance companies such as the AA and RAC are developing bespoke, or have developed bespoke services for electric vehicles, electric fleets. So I know that there are specific options out there for both businesses and individuals running electric vehicles. Yeah.
But that is good to hear, and I'm sure that anyone getting in touch would be able to find their way through to the answers to those. Perhaps some of our other panelists can chip in on that as well. A question from Angus Gribben. There appear to be restrictions in having larger electric vehicle options. What are these restrictions? And I don't know if, Angus, if you had something particular in mind there. Poppy, does anything spring to mind with that? I mean, certainly I could speak to the experience I've had with larger vehicles.
Well, I guess only that, you know, in terms of development of vehicles, I guess we're quite far along in the development of cars, and there are quite a lot of passenger car options out there. Then, as you mentioned, smaller vans are a bit behind that, but there are an increasing number of options. And then, you know, larger vehicles, whether it's HGVs, buses, lorries, etc., are a bit behind that as well, because, you know, they often have very specific needs. So I think sort of broad answer is that these things are all coming. It's just that they're at a slightly later stage.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, Angus, not knowing what your particular situation is there, but certainly my experience was that it's exactly what you said, Poppy, that there's a lot of choice at the smaller end. You know, because it's taking longer for the larger vehicles to come online at the moment, there's perhaps less choice. If your use case fits neatly into what's available, it will be fine. But, you know, if certainly because I was dealing with quite a varied fleet, what we'd find is we had to kind of pick and choose where those vehicles were going to be appropriate. And you know, every year as something new would come onto the market, we were like, oh, excellent, that's going to fill a gap, that's going to fill a gap. So you could see that the offering was broadening. And again, it was also, you know, one of these things when you get into medium and large size vans, for example, so not that large a vehicle in the scheme of things, we were finding that actually it came down to what the particular use of the van was, because if it needed to be kitted out with a ladder on the roof and particular kinds of equipment, then, you know, that was going to make a difference to the weighting or what was possible with the exact spec of the van. Whereas obviously, you know, if you've got 5 different or 10 different options on the market, you're going to find one probably that works for you. Whereas, you know, when it's early days, that was harder. So yeah, it's definitely our experience. So let's see, what else have we got here? So here's a question from Nitesh Tadani. Are there any compliance or regulations around overcharging and anything around mandating smart charging? I don't know if that's your realm of things, Poppy. Do you have any insights on that?
I don't totally understand the first part of the question. I know, I mean, when it comes to smart charging, the government's obviously launching consultations into ensuring that all charging is smart and also easily usable, so with a simple RFID card. So you know, that again, there are improvements coming when it comes to the charging network. I don't know if that was quite what.
No, I'm not sure either, Nitesh. If we haven't answered your question, maybe pop in a follow-up question for one of our next Q&A slots, and we'll see if we can find the right answer for you. Well, thank you very much indeed, Poppy. We've had loads more questions come in, which is super exciting. Unfortunately, we are going to have to move on, but thank you so much for your insights on that, and we will welcome you back for some chat with the other panelists towards the end of the session. So thank you very much, Poppy.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, so before we move on to our next speaker, we have our second poll, and that should be appearing on your screen now. There it is. So how important is data in your transition and ongoing operation of electric vehicles? And appreciating from the previous poll, not everybody's in quite the same place with that journey. So I think answer from where you are right now, the extent to which data is important for you. So very important, somewhat important, not very important, or not considered at all. And if you can get clicking on that, we will process it all through and make those results available shortly. There, they should be coming up. There we go. So really clear there. Very, very important, and certainly somewhat important for the vast majority. That's an excellent introduction for our next speaker. So David Savage, Associate Vice President, UK and Ireland at our event partner, Geotab. David, warmly welcome you to our stage and to our digital audience, and a really clear signal about the importance of data to that audience, and everyone's with us. So I suspect that by the time we get around to the Q&A with you, that we'll have loads more questions coming in. That is a cue for our audience to get those questions coming in. So let's open up the conversation together. I mean, firstly, could you talk about the role that data has in the transition to electric vehicles?
Sure. So I think firstly, it's important to touch upon the importance of the transition from internal combustion engine to EV, and also the challenges that this poses for fleet managers. It's probably the greatest challenge that fleet managers have faced in a very long period of time. And this has been obviously expedited by the government announcement in December of last year on the ban of sale of diesel and petrol vehicles by 2030. Now, when fleets looking to transition, we're seeing two models in the market at the moment. One is a very, very basic model that is not using data to drive that change. So it's almost looking at, so let's say fleet manager A has always operated with a particular manufacturer. They've then just been looking to switch that out for the EV equivalent. Obviously, there's pretty significant risk inherent in that because payloads can be different, range might not match up, etc. Data is incredibly important and really helps mitigate the risk of transition for all fleets, but particularly those larger fleets, or as you touched upon earlier, fleets with mixed types of vehicles in there. And data is important in all aspects of the change to EV, from transition through to operation through to scaling. So if we look at transition almost as the kind of the kickoff point. So the first level of data at Geotab that we would look to support our resellers and end customers on would be to really understand the performance of the existing fleets. So looking at understanding vehicle and trip specifics. So how long a vehicle is out on the road, for example. We would then take this data, and we'd require a minimum of 3 weeks data, and we can do up to 12 months, and plug this into our EVSA tool, which is the Electric Vehicle Suitability Assessment platform we have. That will ingest all of that data and then make informed recommendations on suitable vehicles to help transition out the internal combustion engine vehicles within a fleet. So these results will be fully customizable, and there are parameters within the platform to allow fleet managers to make that level of customization, looking at different temperature levels, etc. And actually the output is based on real vehicle inputs. So it's not an algorithm, it's based on trial of vehicles that we've undertaken. Mm-hmm. And ultimately the output will provide very clear recommendations first on and cost effectively factoring daily completion of tasks on one charge, because obviously a vehicle being plugged in is not great. It's reducing the uptime of that vehicle, which will ultimately help on reducing range anxiety. We can then look at the cost of savings on there, the reduction in carbon footprint, and also the charging infrastructure required, which is obviously a key component to that. And as I said, all based on real vehicle data. And I think from a procurement perspective, there's a real shift that's having to take place, and that is looking at the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle over an internal combustion engine, because it is significantly different. And really, when you look at the TCO of an EV, it's actually very comparable to an internal combustion engine vehicle, and is coming down at a rate of knots. And then the other key component I think that is really important for fleet managers to consider when they're looking at telematics or data offering is how many vehicles are supported by their partner. So there are 500 electric vehicles due to be for sale by the end of 2022. So that's obviously increasing at an incredible rate.
Absolutely.
And at Geotab, we currently support 115 different electric vehicle makes and models, and we have capacity to add 30 to 40 per quarter. So it means we can push up towards that 500 figure, and we are looking at ways of accelerating that. But that make and model support is critical, not just to support the transition, but also the running and scalability of electric fleets over time.
So that's interesting. Could you say something about the running of the fleets then? How can data be utilized when operating an electric fleet?
Sure. So once the transition has taken place and the shift very much, there's a real shift towards optimization, we can provide data on things like driving efficiency, real-time state of charge, for example, the charging patterns more generally. Understanding driving efficiency actually is critically important to the successful implementation and running of an EV fleet. Mm-hmm. Driver is integral to that success. So pulling out data in relation to harsh braking, The impact of running a heater, for example, can have, an impact on battery life and therefore the range, which is something to take into account. Things like tire pressure as well also impacts the range of a vehicle. So there's lots of different aspects that can feed into that and can help a fleet manager make informed decisions around running their fleets on a daily, monthly and annualized basis. The other aspect that we can pull out, which is also very important, is the change in the running costs, so total cost of ownership. So an electric vehicle, as we all know, has far fewer mechanical parts, and therefore maintenance costs are less, but they're only less if driver behavior is marrying up to improve the efficiency of the running of the vehicle. So there's a real relationship there between the driver input and the success of the implementation and running of an EV fleet.
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because certainly when I was all involved in this, and that was just over a year ago now, is when I stopped working on that, which is a lifetime in the world of e-mobility. As you say, actually, there was an assumption about lower maintenance costs, but not necessarily confidence about that, being realized, or, for example, understanding the kinds of behavioral things that would be needed to realize it. So fantastic to see that you have those kinds of insights.
Yeah, and there's been a real shift. One of the blockers probably even a year ago was range anxiety. That's been somewhat mitigated now by the improvements in battery life, battery range, and also the vehicle options out in market. So it's very much shifted towards, we now need to do this, but what's the total cost of ownership and what are all the components that are ultimately going to deliver success?
And you've introduced a lot of ideas there about what's involved, and what are the benefits that your clients are seeing?
Well, there's two primary ones. So the total cost of ownership is the one I picked up earlier. If you look at the battery side of it, that continues to reduce in price. 10 years ago, it was around £1,000 per kilowatt hour. It's now down at less than 100. So those costs are continuing to come down pretty rapid rate. We've got the lower maintenance costs, which is obviously dependent on, the driver inputs, longer servicing cycles, which means there's more uptime for the vehicle. And obviously electricity is cheaper than petrol or diesel. So that's, obviously a significant benefit as well. The tax benefits that Poppy touched upon earlier. And also, if vehicles are in and out of London on a daily basis, there's about a £4,000 a year saving on the congestion charge, which is pretty significant as well. And then the other aspect is the CO2 and the sustainability standpoint, which is obviously it's on everyone's map. EVs, as we know, don't produce emissions. So every EV vehicle that is added into a fleet helps reduce the carbon footprint of the company, as the end customer. And I think the other thing that we need to see over time will actually be what the impact is on fleet renewal cycles. With less maintenance involved, will an end customer be able to get a greater lifetime out of the running of an EV over an ICE vehicle?
Really interesting. And interesting how that thread has come through from the discussion with Poppy about those similar things and all the same kinds of points, but from the perspective of, I guess, the questioning and how you get your head around them at the beginning of the journey, and then seeing that comes out of the data and can be part of the insights that you're actually providing people through that data. So that's absolutely fantastic. Okay, so I can see that we have had quite a few questions coming in here. Let me just take a closer look at what we've got. Helps if I have the right one in front of me. There we go. So, oh my gosh, the first one has some syllables in it. Let me try you on this one. I hope you will know what this means. So the question is from Benny Barr. How do you see the X-by-wire homologation certification process in the UK and Europe? Is there any concern from fleet managers? Is this a question? I hope this makes sense to you. I'm afraid this is beyond my technical expertise in fleets. So, yes, please take it away.
Yeah, beyond my technical expertise as well. But if I can take that one offline, as with any of the other questions, if we've got too many to run through, then we're happy to get back to the individual.
And you and I at least will learn something new. Hopefully, we can pass that on. Another one from Alejandro. Geotab has been gaining traction in accessing CV data. How important will that be as EV fleets roll out? What specific value can be provided back to fleet owners?
That's a very good question. we have been gaining some access to it. So the data is pretty much going to help on the, really truly on the support on that transition, but we don't want to talk too much about it because we're still at fairly early stages of pulling that kind of data.
Okay, cool. And just for anybody in the audience who doesn't know what he's referring to with CV data versus EV data.
I presumed you meant commercial vehicles specifically, but I could be wrong.
Okay. Excellent. All right, let's see what else have we got here. What proportion of cars do the UK estimate be being made and sold in 2030? Although this is the last year for new sales, 2030, what percentage do we believe will be being made and sold as a percentage? That I'm not sure I can answer that one. It's probably a little bit beyond you, but maybe we can take that one away as well. So how do you ascertain what the best charging infrastructure is required for a company's fleet? And this is from Victoria Whitaker. And I can understand that question actually, because there is a bit of a chicken egg in understanding what vehicle you want and therefore what charging you need, but also what charging you'll have in order to work out what vehicle you can get.
Yeah, it's very much going to depend on the type of fleet, size of fleet, and the ranges involved, the makes and models, etc. So that there's a lot of very, very different parameters that can be factored into making that recommendation. But what we're certainly seeing is a greater push towards partnership between telematics, charging networks, OEMs, local authorities, etc., to be able to build out a really solid and robust picture around what the best type of charging is going to be. And actually the utilities are going to have a big part to play in the success of that over time.
And I guess there's some differences between, companies, certainly in my experience, obviously with quite a large fleet and different site locations that we could look to putting in our own charging infrastructure, whereas presumably other businesses are, if not wholly reliant, much more dependent on publicly accessible charging infrastructure.
Yeah, certainly the larger fleets we deal with are looking to do absolutely that, and putting in their own charging infrastructure. The smaller fleets will be relying on local depot charging or even home charging in that regard, depending on the complexion of their fleet and driver network.
A nice question that we've had in here from Paul Barnfather. How important is driver training for a successful EV fleet rollout? And then on a similar note, Matthew Raffin has asked, as driver inputs are critical to the EV efficiency, how is data being used to train drivers? So yeah, really interested in that one.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's probably, as I've said earlier, one of the key components to driving the success of that transition. If we look at particularly the light commercial vehicle side of it, where drivers have probably been driving around for decades in diesel vehicles that you can be a little bit heavier underfoot on, you can brake a little bit harder, etc. The transition to EV requires a much more delicate touch. So that driver education, we can pull out data and you can work directly with the end customer to understand what it is exactly they're looking to achieve from the data pool. But things like harsh braking, harsh acceleration, speeding, running a heater too much, and building out that picture of how the specific fleet, and that maybe even down to the specific driver, operates, we can go that deep, will help inform the success of that transition. So the driver inputs are critical, and probably one of the elements that don't get quite as much coverage as infrastructure or the transition to EV. But
have you seen that data being used in a kind of driver engagement way? Because I know, and this is not even talking about electric fleets, but so local to Oxford, where Green TV are based and the EV Summit is located, our bus companies have done a lot on essentially league tabling their drivers. And created quite a competition around performance and efficiency in their buses. Have you seen that done with the data that you're able to provide?
Yeah, we offer something called a driver scorecard, which is something similar. So a little bit of gamification amongst drivers can have significant upside, but there are inherent risks in more of the unionized driver basis, and that's one of the challenges that we're starting to encounter as we try to support our resellers and end customers on educating driver behavior.
Well, very, very important point to take away, because there's a big human factor to this, isn't there? Well, thank you so much for your insights on that. I am absolutely sure that we won't be able to get through all the questions, but we got through many of them, and there'll be lots more to discuss later when we welcome you back for a chat with the other panelists. So thank you very much, David. So next up is James McKeamy from PodPoint, a leader here in the UK for charging infrastructure solutions. Now, once again, massive thank you to our audience for getting those great questions in already. Some of them a little bit too complicated, but we will take them away. If you have questions for James, please just get typing them into the Q&A as soon as you would like. Now, James, one of the challenges with fleet electrification is this chicken and egg that we've talked about, and the challenge of charger access. So whether that's investment in deploying your own charge points as a business, or confidence about access to third-party networks. So can we kick off the conversation, talk a bit about that? I think you might be on mute. Yes.
I am no longer on mute. Thank you very much indeed, Mary. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. Yeah, so there's absolutely no doubt that charging infrastructure is rather critical to the world of fleet electrification. We demean our product development team by suggesting we make plug sockets with radios, and ultimately that is exactly what we do. That's what they are, but they are fundamental to the transition. And I think your question usefully alluded to there is no one type of charger, and there is no one sort of charging solution. So when we look at a fleet application, it's really important to understand the dynamics of the fleet. And we've had Geotab talking about understanding telematics, about understanding the type of fleet, their operations, their range requirements, all those sorts of things. When it comes to the charging infrastructure side, the things that we're really interested in is dwell time, where that dwell time takes place. So you're talking about public networks. I think if we look at a fleet, typically we're made up of employee vehicles, which live at people's homes a lot of the time, and then are driven to work and can be charged either at home or in the workplace for the backbone of their charging. Then you have company vehicles, which may well live at a company depot or fleet type application. Now, any of those kind of vehicles which have a very, very long dwell time at a particular site really are prime candidates to go electric. They're very easy to get to. Essentially, the slower your charge rate, the more affordable your charging infrastructure is likely to be. The more challenging vehicles for us to get to, we've already talked a little bit about HGVs, and that's as a physicist, Mary, that's one of the challenges to get to in the long run. But if we think of those who may not have off-street parking at home, who don't visit say an office every day, they go to a different site. So I guess a classic example of this would be let's say a tradesman with a van who may well live in a city with no off-street parking. It's difficult to get him to charge his vehicle, and every day he attends a different site. Therefore, installing a charger for him is probably without, outside the bounds of what is possible for his company. That's going to be one of the more challenging. As such, probably those vehicles are going to go electric latest, okay, and they're going to rely on the development of the public charging infrastructure, which is going to take place largely on the backs of those who can charge more easily, be that at home or in the workplace. One key thing to consider is home charging increasingly is smart charging, and all usage going through home chargers is recorded. And that's one of the things we're seeing quite a lot of now, is reporting back home charging usage for the purpose of work expensing, etc. But in terms of when we approach a fleet, we're typically looking at how do we electrify your workplace, and how can we work with your staff with regards to home charging.
Very, very thorough approach there to the role of EV charging then in kind of the whole of that spectrum of adoption of vehicles at different stages. What about the business case for fleet electrification?
Yeah, well, I think our previous speaker gave some of the indication of the lower running costs. Electricity is cheaper than petrol. It probably always will be. The government is likely to lose fuel duty, but at the moment we don't expect that to appear upon electricity bills, more likely road pricing. We'll do that, fewer moving parts. It's something like 100 times fewer moving parts in an electric car drivetrain versus an internal combustion engine. So it's clear there are benefits to be had from the transition in terms of the lower running costs. Of course, infrastructure costs money though, so we've now got an additional cost. Typically, most organisations will not be installing their own fuelling infrastructure, and this will be a new outlay for them. But the thing is, if you're looking really 3 to 4 times lower running costs, you can make sense of an additional outlay on vehicle and indeed on infrastructure as well. So in terms of case studies, you know, we've got quite a number now of successful workplace installations and fleets transitioning. So one of our case studies you'll find on our website is of Skanska, the building firm. They were our first big array. So it's about 67 active chargers in one car park over there, with capacity in that system to go to 253, I think. We're seeing excellent utilisation of that infrastructure, and we're also seeing it growing very handsomely as well. There was a study in the US a few years ago which found getting an open charger at your workplace car park made you 6 times more likely to drive an electric vehicle, which is an impressive stat, but entirely predictable. If you imagine there is an available charging point at your work, yes, that will make you much more likely to drive an electric car. So it's a very, very effective thing. If we look at a couple of others, we've got some interesting work we're doing with a major broadcast organisation where there is indeed some charging going into their workplace car parks. But there's quite a significant operation to ensure we're recording all their home charge usage as well, and sending that back to the fleet managers, etc. So giving that total picture in terms of costs, etc., allows organisations to make it very clear that they are realising some of these potential benefits and realising that potential business case.
Amazing. So you've hinted at well, not hinted at, but you touched on with some of those examples that fleets and workplace charging can have an impact beyond just the fleet itself. So is there anything else you can say about that? Because fleets are such a large segment of the transport sector. So, you know, there's such a room for influence across the board in terms of fleet adoption in the UK.
Yeah, hugely. I think it's really important to recognise, you know, we're trying to get mass adoption of electric vehicles. The reason we're doing that is because we need to really decarbonise the grid and realise the benefits of that. I have been to one of Poppy's sister organisations' events where someone stood up and said, all your grants are directed towards new vehicles, and that's not fair because most retail consumers are buying second-hand cars, which of course is true. So what are you doing to encourage the growth of the second-hand market? Of course, you can't supply a second-hand vehicle, you can only supply new. And over half of new vehicles are bought by fleets. So it's really, really important that we can encourage fleets to go electric, because they provide the stock of vehicles which become second-hand vehicles, which become affordable to the retail consumer, etc. The one other element I haven't touched on the previous answers is of grid capacity. So dwell time is one element of choosing the right type of charger. If you've got a high dwell time, you can have a low powered charger, 7 kilowatt charger, for example, and they're very easy to load manage. If you've got a very short dwell time, you need a very high powered charger, much harder to load manage. So for example, you can have 27 load managed 7 kilowatt units for one 50 kilowatt DC unit if it's unmanaged. 27 for one, and the cost is usually approximately the same there between the two. Marrying those two up is very, very important, and grid load management technology, making the most of the available capacity, is absolutely critical, because that is the constraint on workplace installations that's universal. It's at every site you go to as you start to look towards mass adoption. I'm conscious we're coming to the end of our 5 minutes, so I need to get that one in.
No, absolutely. But I think brilliant, just touching on the importance of those particular sites and that challenge of the grid connection, which obviously with projects like that is such an important thing to be starting with at the beginning, and understanding how that scopes where you are and how you phase it, for example. So we've had a lot of questions in. We have got a couple relating to drivers going home at night. So one of them is asking whether you have any creative solutions to fleets that are primarily driven by drivers taking commercial homes off night, and particularly picking up that the vast majority might not have access to off-street parking. And then on a similar note, somebody's asked, Simon Gardner's asked, living in a terraced street, how do you resolve cross-pavement charging? Any more thoughts on at-home charging or that particular challenge of terrace housing and cross-street charging?
Sure. So on your first point, we have a luxury in the UK that actually the majority of drivers can charge at home on our street parking. So according to PwC's research about 2-3 years ago, 72% of drivers have off-street parking at home. That's a luxury that the likes of Amsterdam can't afford. They have 95% on-street parking, for example. So we can get a very, very long way on adoption and mass adoption before that becomes a hard stop. On the second question, how do you stop people trailing cables over pavements? We won't install the chargers, is the answer there. So we have legal obligations that we can only install in certain circumstances. We can't foul public rights of way and things like that. Of course, that leads on to, okay, so what do you do about those who can't charge at home? And in fact, prime answer, there is no one silver bullet, I'm afraid. There is no, well, we've got a perfect universal street charger that does every application. That doesn't exist. We may have more on-street charging, but it's going to be a mix. It's going to be a mixture of solutions. And in my view, actually, the workplace charger might be the most useful of all. If your car is doing, and they usually do now do, 250 miles or more of range, if you're charging at your office 10 miles away, you're going to find that really does the backbone of your usage, and then you can use the public network, the destination chargers, the en route high power chargers to get around to do the rest of your charging. So actually, we're talking about fleet, which obviously leads on to workplace. We think that's a huge part of the solution. We actually model in the fullness of time. We think about 60% of all energy will go into people's cars at home. 30% will go into cars at work. So between those two, 90% of all charging, which is, to a rounding error, almost all of it.
So yeah, really interesting perspective. I'll be cheeky with my kind of host prerogative. I'm throwing something in myself here, which is that we've had a press release out. I think it was just this week actually, from Oxfordshire County Council and Oxford Direct Services, the City Council's company, discussing their feasibility study, which is very early days, but it's looking at a cable gully solution. And not just the cable gully solution, because that in itself is very, very simple, bit like a storm drain gully that you can put into the pavement. Actually, as a solution, that's really, really neat. What's complicated is the permissions and things and working out where it can go and all the rest of it. But for anybody interested in that, I'm pretty sure it went out earlier this week. So searching for Oxfordshire County Council cable gully will pull up something to look forward to in the future, we hope.
Yeah, just on that, I think they are neat solutions, but of course it's only one scenario. And Oxford obviously is a beautiful city with many sort of terrace houses with cars parked on the street outside, and that's perfect. That's a scenario. I am someone with no home or work parking, and my car is parked down the lane there on the side of an area. A gully's going to do me no good at all.
No, absolutely, it's not a silver bullet.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, we welcome all those innovations.
Absolutely. Now, I've got distracted myself with that because there was something in here, something in what you said, and I was going to neatly move on to another question. Let me just pull up and see what we have got here. Oh, here's an interesting one. It's picking up on the question of grid connection side of things. It might be a bit technical, so let's see where we get to. But Joe Weatherall asks, are there any grants available from the UK government to support businesses in procuring low voltage networks from local DNOs, i.e. existing low voltage networks are too small and requires increased cables or capacity? So is that something you've come across, or are there other solutions or creative ways to deal with that grid capacity issue?
No, we've talked a bit that I think utilities have a big role to play. I mean, the fundamental limiting factor on the amount of chargers you can install in shared car parking is the LV grid, and absolutely right. Quite often we need to bring in more capacity, and generally that's hard and it's expensive and it takes a long time. So it's a real challenge. Hence, load management has real value as the first step. But in the fullness of time, you do discover places where you need to bring in grid. You want to put in DC chargers. You've got rapid turnaround. We're starting to see that now with some fleets. You're probably going to have to bring in more grid on the LV network, etc. No, sadly, is the answer to a universal national fund for procuring grid. and it kind of gets worse. We've got real sort of market structure challenges there, where the person who triggers the upgrade of the substation pays for all the additional capacity, cannot appreciate that on their books, and the next person who asks gets it for free. So which is a problem. So there are challenges there. The government is looking at a couple of schemes, looking at some options there for passive infrastructure, things like that. But yeah, a direct grant for LV grid increases, no, that doesn't exist yet. But you are right to identify that as a key.
Absolutely, and actually, to be honest with you, I think a lot of, not so much necessarily grants and the kind of grant scheme meaning of things, but innovation grants looking at smart energy systems. And so it's much more about the whole system and how it works and how it interacts and what the services and platforms that go with that, as well as the infrastructure, because you hit the nail on the head. What we don't want to do is have to spend all of the money on upgrading that overhead on the network, when actually we can make our existing energy system deliver more for us now just by being a bit smarter about it. So I think that's probably where a lot of the money is going, but it's maybe on the R&D side.
Yeah, 100%. Maximize flexibility is the first thing we should be doing. There will be some upgrading of the grid as well.
I've no doubt there will be, absolutely, especially on the DC side. So we will just take the opportunity to thank you very much, James, for the insights that you have given us. As with everyone, lots more questions that we couldn't get to, but we will have you back at the end for a bit of chat with our other panelists. So thank you very much. So next up, our final speaker is Ollie Cron, who's head of CSR at DPD UK. Once again, get those questions into the Q&A. We will try and pick up as many as we can. And Ollie, DPD are well on the way to an electrified fleet, are you not? So can you tell us more about how that journey has been for you and your experience of it?
Hi, Mari. Yes, of course. Look, our journey started back in 2018. We opened our first 100% electric urban site in Westminster in the heart of London, 6 months before the ULEZ zone was put into place. So, you know, we've been delivering there ever since, zero emissions. And we've just grown from there, and it's gained momentum. Last year, we started the year with only 149 electric vehicles through obviously a very challenging year, and we finished with 730 vehicles. Wow. We had an ambition to have 10% of fleet transition, and that wasn't just in London or in an urbanised area, that was across every depot across the UK, no matter what territory they were delivering in. So we've not gone for a city or London-centric strategy, we've gone across the UK, electric in every depot. So huge growth, and just to put that into context, 2019 we only delivered, I say only, we only delivered 1.3 million parcels on our EV fleet. Last year, we delivered 11.2 million parcels, zero emissions. I can say that because our depots are all renewable energy as well. And we have the ambition to deliver to 25 towns and cities, zero emissions by the end of 2025. So that shows you our journey is now just absolutely going at full speed. We will have, by the end of this year, 1,500 vehicles on fleet, electric vehicles, and by the end of 2025, it will be 3,500, 4,000 vehicles delivering to those 25 towns and cities, zero emissions, and that will be 25% of our UK population and 25% of our volume, so over 100 million parcels delivered via an EV fleet, zero emissions, which is just amazing.
It's astonishing. It's amazing. Yeah. Well done. So
thank you.
I'm really curious to know then, because we've had Poppy and David and James talking about kind of different stages of the journey. So can you say something about what your journey's been like at DPD?
It's challenging. You know, we're early adopters. The technology is changing very quickly. Out of our 730 vehicles, it's predominantly the Nissan ENV. Our drivers are what we call owner drivers, so they're service partners, and we have gone for the charge at home solution because these guys, it's their vehicle, so they will drive from the depot home to depot and back again. So we, along with the OLEV grant, which sadly got reduced down to £350 last year, which I think is the wrong message to be really sending, but we actually pay £350 towards that home charger. We actually use PodPoint, which James, I'm sure, is keen for me to say. You know, that's been successful. However, we've just been talking about off-street parking or lack of, and it is a challenge in our urban areas. We then have to look at depot, and we are part of our 25-25-25 vision, which is the zero emissions 25 cities. We are investing in upgrading our charging facilities at our depots, but because again, predominantly it's owner driver, they need to publicly charge or at home, and that's where we're working. Obviously, PodPoint have a public charging network throughout the UK, and there are other suppliers that we're seeing a lot of momentum in faster charging, you know, rapid chargers being rolled out. And for me, for our fleet, that is probably more challenging than getting hold of the EVs themselves. The infrastructure is, you know, we need to be able to charge these vehicles so they can operate every day and turn a wheel and deliver our parcels. So the charging infrastructure is the biggest challenge. And for me, it's the more power and the rapid chargers, not the 7 kilowatt chargers for these vehicles, you know, so people can access that, take 35 minutes, top up, go home, come back the next day ready to do a day's work. And I suppose with the off-street parking, typically, because it's an urbanized area like London, our routes have a smaller mileage. So they only average typically 30 miles a day. So they won't have to charge every single day, but we want that convenience, the speed of charge, so they're not hanging around, because I think, again, that's one of the incentives to adopting EVs for them.
Mm-hmm. And interesting, just picking up on that, and I think as we're kind of getting into the chat, but anyway, I'm picking up on a question I've just seen coming in about that at-home solution. How do you handle that in terms of reimbursement? Has that meant a lot of changes to systems or changes for drivers, or actually has it been quite smooth?
No, it's been very smooth. With PodPoint, we started working with PodPoint last July, and the relationship's been really good. The implementation of the charge has been great. But we pay £350 on top of the OLEV grant. The driver typically, unless the cabling is extremely long from obviously the point of power to the charger, they don't have to spend a penny. You know, they don't have to put their hand in the pocket. It is theirs to keep. It's not DPD's. We just pay for it because, again, it's an incentivization of transitioning to electric.
Fantastic. And just curious, thinking about that, like driver engagement side of things, we picked up on it earlier with David around kind of driver behaviours and the effectiveness in terms of the vehicles. Is that something that DPD has got involved in with your drivers?
Definitely. Look, last year we changed our 3-box strategy to a 4-box strategy, and that 4th box was green, and it was to be the UK's leader in sustainable delivery. So by doing that, that ingrains it in every staff members' DNA on a daily basis. So that they've been embraced really positively. We've had to do training because they are not a diesel vehicle. Yes, there's less moving parts, and we haven't had sort of breakdowns, but we've seen an increase in tyre usage because of the torque. And maybe then that's where the education comes in a bit more as well, that you don't drive.
What makes you happy drivers, Ollie?
Yeah, but I have to say, Mari, I was an operator before becoming head of CSR at DPD, and when I was in the depot and they knew that new EVs were being delivered, I would have a line of drivers saying, when can I have the next one, and the public perception and the engagement when delivering as well in these vehicles has been amazing. The public have really embraced it, and they ask the drivers so many questions, obviously social distancing now, obviously, when they're asking those questions. But it's great to see. It's a real good feel-good factor that we're doing something positive.
So let's have a look at the Q&A then, because I can see questions coming in literally as I'm talking, new ones in front of me. here's a question around the extent to which, so you touched on the fact that not all drivers can charge at home and what that means, and looking at depot charging. And is that, somebody has asked, Paul Andrew James says, is there a need for rapid chargers to be at the depots? Is that the kind of thing that you envisage as a solution to that, where perhaps drivers could load the vehicle, you know, while there's additional charging going on?
We go back to the point of electrical capacity, DNO involvement with our rollout, and I'm sure we would probably have one of the largest private charging networks once we've completed our 25 vision. We're looking at 22 kilowatt and above, because we do want people to be faster, you know, if they're utilizing them in depot. And something that we are progressing is, because we know there's a challenge in public charging. All our chargers for the fleet are inside our fence line, they're secure, and they're only obviously utilised by DPD vehicles. But we want to install more chargers in our car parks to open up to the public in the daytime. And then that means that we can utilise those extra chargers at the night time with our fleet. So, you know, again, that helps. And I have raised this with Olev, actually, in one of my conversations, is there a grant scheme that we could, or a more incentivised grant scheme from the government that would mean that private business install chargers for public use, and then obviously then that expands the charging network massively, accelerates it. And I think it'd be a win-win. So, you know, watch this space. I
don't think you'll be the only private organisation interested in that model as well. I mean, that certainly makes a lot of sense, right? Because we all know from a charging infrastructure point of view, utilisation is one of the key things in that investment. And if it's making more use of the infrastructure that goes in, that it seems like a win-win, as you say. So a question around charging and whether that's leading to, I mean, you said on the kind of urban areas that obviously you've got lower mileage, so overnight charging and not necessarily every night can work for your drivers. But do you see increased downtime? Is downtime during charging an issue in your operations at all?
STEM time was in travel, Mari? Or?
As in downtime while recharging is happening on the vehicle?
That wouldn't happen in the day en route. They do it overnight, or like you were saying, as they're loading up, so they could be on a rapid charger and do that. We've been discussing with Westminster Borough Council Highways about curbside rapid charging, especially in London and other cities, because it won't be just us. There's like bin lorry fleets and, you know, other carriers that will need that access. And if you're talking about a property, you know, a logistics business or another that has a large fleet, you will not be able to charge 200 vehicles overnight. It's going to be a hell of a challenge to do that. And this is where you need, in my opinion, the rapid charge curbside element that the driver could be doing a 30-minute break, having his or her lunch, and again, be topped up, ready to go, and not an issue.
Interesting, though, I suppose that that downtime issue hasn't really been one for you, and that comes back to that data point about understanding the fleet as it operates ahead of electrification and having the confidence about what kind of charging needs there will be for different journeys and looking at the range, all that kind of side of things.
Something that I always speak to potential charging suppliers is the ability to book a slot as well would be really good, because then you would time it in your lunch hour. You've already booked it. There's not going to be someone else on the charge when you arrive. So it could be quite smooth. Well, I envisage it being a smooth process.
Excellent. Well, glad to hear that. And I've just spotted comment has come in. Joel Teague from Co-Charger says they're already in discussions with OZEV about a charger sharing grant. Can we join forces to convince them? So I think you were building allies on that point already on this one, Ollie.
Yeah, just reach out to me. That'd be great. I'll take it offline.
Definitely. A question here from Joshua Gordon. The cost of charging can vary substantially in terms of obviously home connected chargers, public charging, workplace charging. So how do you deal with that difference? Do you encourage one way of charging over another? Obviously your drivers own their vehicle, so presumably there's an element of choice in how they're using their vehicles anyway.
Yeah, they have their own choice. Obviously, home charging would typically be cheaper because, you know, your own tariffs that you have. At the moment, although this will change in the future, our chargers at site are all on free vend. But then that is unfair to a service provider in a diesel vehicle, because we do not allow people just, you know, fill up their diesel tank with our diesel. So there'll be a change where they will be charged, but not in a grossly inflated charge rate per kilowatt. You know, it will be literally, you know, cost neutral to us. We will not be profiteering out of that.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful to hear. Well, Ollie, we will wrap it up in terms of questions for you just now. So thank you again for those insights. Really exciting and just thoroughly amazing job that you guys are doing at DPT. It's very, very impressive.
Thank you.
We're going to lose you for a second while we go to our next poll, but then bring you right back along with the other panelists for some further Q&A. So just before we bring the panel back, we have our final poll question for you. So that has just popped up. Please get voting on that. What is your overarching factor in terms of moving to electric? So is it sustainability targets within your organisation? Is it responding to government policies or taking advantage of incentives? Fleet economics, or something else entirely? So get voting there, and we will have the result of that poll up shortly. It should be popping up soon. There we go. So again, a mix, but definitely sustainability targets and fleet economics being the highest, which I think is interesting given that we have got such a clear steer from government, and something that, you know, we touched on might be kind of overwhelming and you'd expect to be a driver. So so really a spread there, which is encouraging, I think. So now I would like to reconvene our full panel, and we will get them asking questions of one another. So welcome back, James, David, Ollie has come back, and we are waiting for Poppy. There is Poppy, fantastic. So David, as our panel partner, can I ask you to pop the first question to the other panelists, and if you could just point out who that's for, or which of our panelists your question is for.
Sure, probably directed at James firstly. James, I know you've got a sore throat, so apologies that I'm going to you first. There was a survey completed at the end of last year, and one of the overriding challenges or concerns based from fleet managers was around charging infrastructure and facility upgrade costs being quite high. You know, what's your kind of take on the value and mitigation from a supplier standpoint?
I'm afraid I lost the first part of your question, David. It was about upgrading sites in terms of you know, capacity, and then the value of mitigation. Was that the question?
Please. Yeah.
And what you were asking, how we quantify the value of mitigation, or?
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess we come at this another way, which is ultimately we'll be brought in to provide as much charging infrastructure as a client wants to have. Unfortunately, quite often you'll find these days that they can have less than they might desire, because the capacity there is much lower. What we do by offering mitigation, as you call it, load management, is to maximize the provision you can get before you start hitting, you know, capital cost on grid upgrade. So it will be hard for us to give you a figure, and the other problem with categorizing it is the difference in the cost to upgrade the supply is very variable, right? So if you've got a feeder or a substation with a lot of capacity, occasionally that's changing a fuse, right? And it's quite simple and straightforward to do. If we go to sites around London where you have almost all the substations are running at capacity, you'll have to upgrade your substation, possibly the next one as well, and your costs can spiral like into hundreds of thousands of pounds or worse. And then obviously that's completely unviable. So you won't take that on. That makes it hard to say, well, we save X percentage. But essentially, we usually come in and try and get as much infrastructure as we can on that supply before we have to go above it. But of course, we are now getting increasing experience of bringing in additional supplies as well. Ollie's talked about going to 3-phase power, and I mentioned already we're looking at certain fleet applications which use DC as well. That involves getting to know DNOs, IDNOs, ICPs, initial connection providers, etc., and understanding the tricks of the trade in that as well to keep those costs as low as possible.
So interesting there, again, coming back to that thing about the grid connection side, and I'm just thinking, Poppy, I wonder, for someone who's right at the beginning of their journey, there's obviously quite a lot of things going on there. Would you like to comment on whether they should be worrying about that or how they get their heads around these issues, and then perhaps pose your question to the panel?
So, I mean, I guess the answer to the first part is yes, I'm sure they should be worrying about those things, because obviously, particularly in light of the poll that you just shared, clearly cost is one of the main things that businesses are looking at here. So if it's going to cost them a large amount of money to upgrade electricity supply, etc., then that's certainly something that they're going to need to be factoring in, because you know, as others, David's, you know, talked about the total cost of ownership, there are sort of clear examples of how that can reduce costs, but that's talking about the vehicle. So yes, certainly other elements such as how you actually get that electricity and the right amount of it there absolutely does need to be considered. I suppose in terms of a question, as a marketer, I'm always interested in what sort of people think about all this stuff. So a question for Ollie, I think. I talked about how some businesses we've spoken to in the past have seen this move to electric and sort of more sustainable choices across the board. They see it as a marketing tool. And I wondered what DPD kind of think in that area. Are your customers keen to know what you're doing in this area, and do they respond well to your move to electric vehicles?
Yeah, I have to say now that since 2013, we've actually offsetted prior to electric vehicles being really sort of available. So we've been way ahead of it. It's not new, that we're being sustainable. We're just accelerating that, and we continue to offset the emissions that we can't deal with at the moment, like HGVs, for example. And we think that's the responsible thing to do, because doing something is better than doing nothing. And as you hopefully heard from all the great figures that I presented, we're really moving at pace now. There is more interest from customers, I think, because consumers and people generally are being more focused on environmental and sustainability initiatives. Before the pandemic hit, a year ago nearly, there wasn't a day that went by that there wasn't a issue on the news, a headline about ocean plastics or forest fires or temperature of the globe, changing weather patterns. So I think, especially the demographic of an online shopper, that sort of age group, they're very focused on how they get the product and the parcels now, I think, and that will continue. It's not a marketing ploy. It's a duty. We believe that it's the right thing to do. There's a huge amount of investment in vehicles and infrastructure to do it, but we believe that it's about being responsible and doing the right thing. And myself, I've got an 8-year-old daughter. Like a lot of people, obviously have children. You think, what's it going to be like when they're my age? And it's doing the right thing, and that's where we stand, DPD, and why we're doing, and people want that. The consumer wants to have a clear conscience of how they've got their item and had it delivered.
Absolutely. David and James, maybe come to David first. Curious to know if you see that in your clients as well, in terms of their experience of the marketing or perhaps more broadly responsible business side of this journey.
There are marketing upsides for it inevitably, but it's actually been driven, as Ollie said, by doing the right thing. Certainly in most of the customers, we're encountering. We've all seen the impact of climate change, in our own lives, over the last decade or even longer than that. And you start looking at that, and as Ollie said, the impact on the next generation, to come through. And certainly, I'm a bit like Ollie. I've got a young daughter, and been looking at it myself and going, actually, there's a lot we're not doing very right here, and we need to address that. And I think it's just been, a bit of a perfect storm in terms of regulatory change is actually just helping to accelerate the journey that most companies were already on and trying to move through. So I think that's, ultimately around doing the right thing. And as Ollie said, there are a generation who are, reliant on last mile delivery, who want to understand not just how the products they've ordered are being made and how that company is dealing ethically and also sustainably, but also how that item is then being delivered. So I think there's just been a real shift in society that has been accelerated. And to be honest, I've seen more of an acceleration over the last year during lockdown than even prior to that. So I think we've all got a part to play in that and adding to that value chain. And I would expect most fleets will probably be where they want to be prior to the 2030 government guideline. There seems to be a lot more impetus and desire to get there now than there's ever been.
Amazing to hear. And James, you've been nodding. I assume that you agree with that. We know you've got a sore throat. You can just say yes if you like.
Well, I'm in now. I'm committed. I'll keep chatting. Yeah, no, I do very much agree with that. I think obviously we see customers across the piece, from individual drivers through to fleet managers, through to organisations like Tesco looking to put these units in. And I'd say the common thread is proper its mission, travel shouldn't damage the earth. We're trying to reduce man's impact on the globe. I think the answers that have been given there and the answers on that poll were all very accurate and good reasons. The one I think that was left out, and I think this is a really important one, is that electric cars are awesome. And actually that's going to start to win the day, because they're just fundamentally better cars than petrol cars could ever be. And the consumer experience is fundamentally better so long as you get your charging solution right. Our petrol cars don't fuel themselves, and trust me, once you've tried an electric vehicle and gone back to an internal combustion engine vehicle, you'll understand what I say. But actually, the products themselves and the capability of them is so awesome and getting better all the time that I think people are going to want to do these whether they care about the environment or not. And that's one of the things that makes me so optimistic. We don't need to convince everyone to care like David Attenborough does. But if you can give them a better solution, they'll do it anyway.
Absolutely. So, James, we're with you. Would you like to pose your question to the other panelists?
Yeah, I'd love to talk to Ollie more and ask him how he manages to be so awesome, because those numbers are amazing. But I did actually get to do that. You can go and see me interviewing him online a short while ago, so I have to leave him be. And I'm going to come to David, and the focus on data is absolutely sort of critical here. And the one of the pieces of data as an infrastructure operator we struggle to get is state of charge. We're given that in the DC infrastructure, but it's not in the AC standard. And that can have some limitations on some of the smart charging applications we've got. So I was going to ask, how do you get around that limitation? Just on
I have to defer to someone more technical than I am on that. That's exactly how we're pulling that. But I'll get back to you on that one offline, James. Okay, no worries, no worries. Shall I change my question then and go to Poppy? And Poppy, you've been at Go Ultra Low for a little while now. And I just want you to give me a sort of a general view of how you felt the market sort of sentiment has changed over those years, because I see us now having to convince less and inform more. I'd like to hear it from you, how you've noticed that change.
Yeah, interestingly, I would completely echo that sentiment. You're right. I've been at Go Ultra Low for about 6 years, and when I first joined, one of pretty much our main objectives was to raise awareness of electric cars, because about 6 years ago, I know it sounds kind of crazy, really, being so really not that long ago at all, but people even just didn't really know about electric cars, that they even existed. And certainly that has changed rapidly over time. So raising awareness is not one of our key objectives now. It's about building on that. And also, again, touching on what you said previously, one of the main things that we do before we start talking to people about at the detail of what they need to consider when they're buying or choosing or driving an electric car, actually one of the things we do is get them excited about them because they are awesome cars. So we do that through making them look cool in ads or running events where they can test drive them around a racetrack or something like that. You know, the first job is to make sure that people know how cool they are. Just a little anecdote, we run an event at Brands Hatch every year at the British Touring Car Championship. So all the people there are kind of self-proclaimed petrol heads, as it were. We get them test driving electric cars around the racetrack and they come out of it absolutely loving them. You know, we do a little survey afterwards, ask them what they think, and, you know, almost without exception, they're completely blown away in a really good way about the performance, the handling, the look, the feel, all of that stuff about these cars that we're offering for test drive. So and it's important, I think, for everyone else to know about that as well, because actually that's the sort of thing that's going to make people buy them or lease them or rent them or whatever it is. You know, people buy cars generally in quite a personal way. They see it as a reflection of their own brand in some way. They get quite emotional about it. They buy them in an emotional way. So actually, the thing this is probably not so much the case for businesses, but certainly for individuals, the thing that's going to get them buying them is whether they think they're cool or not, basically. So yeah, absolutely. So to answer your main point, I've absolutely seen a change in terms of you know, people's perception of electric cars and what we need to tell them about them to convince them of them in a way. Yeah, definitely.
Amazing. And you can just hear the emotion coming from you when you're talking about them and those events, Poppy. So fantastic. Ollie, we've got time for you to pose a question to the other panelists before we wrap up.
I'll go to James because obviously charging is a really important piece for our successful rollout or transition to electric. Do you think, James, that or what can the government do more to ensure that we're kitted out and ready for 2030? Because what I don't want is a Brexit moment, and in the 11th hour, we're still wondering what we're doing. So what could they do more? And have they committed enough money to EV charging? Because personally, I don't think there's enough.
They should definitely give me more money, Ollie. I can guarantee that. Yeah, I don't think we want to negotiate no deal to the wire and then put the charges in on the 31st of December 2029. I don't think that's a good idea. I think the bulk of this has to come from the private sector, and I think a large portion of it has to come from users. You know, the people who are ultimately going to use the infrastructure should largely be paying for it. But there are some areas where the government can help. And you've mentioned a bit about the public network. I think there's some real constraints around the en route network at the moment. So trying to do serious en route charging. So we're talking 150 kilowatt up to 350 kilowatt at scale at motorway services is really hard and takes very, very large grid costs. And we are heartened to see, after a bit of campaigning, particularly from some of the carrots at National Grid, that the government has taken that very, very seriously with Project Rapid and the Rapid Charging Fund, looking to potentially underwrite the grid costs and then operate sites commercially. We think that's very, very sensible. Now, if you can fix that part of the picture, range anxiety doesn't exist anymore. You can go anywhere you want. We think it's a very small part of charging, by the way. We think it's roughly 3-5% of the energy, but it's really important because if you don't have it, your car's limited to half its range because you've got to get there and you've got to get back. If you can fix that, the car is free to go wherever it wants. Emotionally, that's a big hurdle, but practically it is as well. If you look at your fleets, you know they're never going to get marooned now because if they're doing range, they're going to be okay. You know, would we like additional grants for additional stuff? Yes, of course, but you know, I don't think that's practical for me to talk about. And maintaining some of these early market incentives, I think the BIC incentive, which we mentioned, particularly in the fleet environment, is really, really important. Maintaining that with real clear visibility for an extended period would be very, very valuable as well. But ultimately, I think most of the infrastructure is going to come down to the likes of ourselves. And if I'm honest, Ollie, pioneers like yourself, finding ways to get this done, leading the way. And targeting where that infrastructure is really going to do the most to further your own fleet's capabilities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. And I think really just for me to say a massive, massive thank you to all of our panelists. for all of your insights and a really lively discussion. It's been fantastic. I think we could stay here probably for the rest of the evening chatting away on this topic and still not have run out of things to talk about. So thank you very, very much for your insights. A massive thank you to our audience for your attendance. Some excellent questions. We couldn't get through them all, and we had to put a few of them to be taken away for the technical ones, but really, really brilliant to have your engagement on this. And I hope that you have found the insights that our panelists have shared as interesting as I have. We hope to see you all again at our next EV Online Summit event. Thank you very much.